Hello students, and welcome to yet another in a series of video lectures. And today we're going to be spending some time in chapter 8 talking about the importance of assessment as you are working through the groups that you will be actually conducting. So without any further ado, let's move into our lesson for today. So assessment groups is where we're actually going to spend a little bit of time today. And talking about the skills that you will need. And as you'll remember, I've said to you often in class, and hopefully you're paying attention, that a good social worker is always assessing. So we're always taking in information to help us make decisions about what we do with the folks that we work with. And so groups assessments is no different. It's just different in the fact that you're looking at an entire group process that you'll be responsible for. So today we're going to spend some time talking about and defining the assessment. We're going to also talk about the process. We're going to look at the functioning, assessing the functioning of group members as well as the entire group, the environment, and then linking the assessment to the intervention. Assessment is defined as both a process and a product upon which the helping process is based. And you can find the references for this in the back of your book. But for us, in terms of how we look at the group process, it is still about gathering the information and organizing it and making judgments about it. When you think about the format, the therapeutic format of group, and what it's designed to do, whether it's a task or a treatment group, you have to be able to actually know along the way as you are, whether you are making adequate progress as a group or not. Are you meeting your goals? Are you defining your purpose? And we would also encourage the leaders of the groups, as you're in co-leaders, in a co-leadership model, to really spend quite a bit of time discussing the group process during the meeting. So the members of the group need to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish, where it is you're going, and so spend as much time as you need to make sure that those things are actually covered. So again, we talked about assessment being this process, and so when we look at the process, it's about collecting data. And so you're wanting to get data from as many different places as you can to make sure that you're accurate. If you're just looking at one form of gathering data about how well your group is doing, you need to branch out and look at some other particular ways to do that. When at all possible, you want to involve the members of that particular group. You also want to discuss these things with your co-leader. And then you also want to avoid biasing the data when possible. So how you frame the questions, the information you gather, are they really gathered in a way that's slanted toward an outcome that might be more predictable? And so you always want to try to control for those things when you are actually looking at that assessment piece. And so at the bottom of your page here, here are some things that you can think about utilizing as you're doing your own groups. Participant comments. And so this is a tool that I've used and created basically to really look at the end of each group session, how did the participants view that particular session. So I'll maybe ask a few simple questions like, what did you learn? How can you apply it? Was it useful? Things like, what could we have done to make the session better? Or was it on target? And so that gives you quick anecdotal information from all the participants that you could aggregate that give you some sense about how well you're meeting your marks. You can also do pre-test, post-test, giving folks some method of testing to find out what their knowledge base is about the subject at the first group, and then doing that same test again at the end of the group and looking at what the difference is. As well as in some cognitive behavioral therapy groups, doing homework, so actually teaching a skill and then actually sending people out into the community to try it and then report back to group. These are all ways of gathering data and assessing what's happening with your group. When you're thinking about also, when you're looking at group functioning, so you need to look at now the members, and you want to look at and keep in mind, depending on the type of group you're running, what's happening in that person's life. The intrapersonal life. And when we talk about intrapersonal, we're talking about situations that this person will find themselves in on an ongoing basis. So people will be a part of families, people will be a part of friendship networks, people will be a part of working environments. So that would be the interpersonal life of that person. So looking at that life, what's going on for them at that moment, how they interact, and the environments that they're actually interacting in. And we also listed some methods of looking at assessing that group functioning. And so there are member self-observation, worker observation, reports by others outside of the group, as well as standardized instruments that you can actually utilize. And so again, this assessment provides a basic baseline for the members so they can compare their progress as the group progresses. Assessment also helps members to understand that their concerns and problems and allows them to normalize them. So you're in that group setting and it's everyone is having some of the same types of issues. Members also should be encouraged to do their own research about the problems and treatment methodologies so that they're better informed consumers. And then always looking at strength-based assessments in terms of what members' resiliency and capacity to make change actually are. These are all important things to remember as you're looking at assessing members. And then also assessment enables members to see what methods have been tried already to resolve the problem, or what issues that are facing the group, and what promising avenues that they could actually look at following. So again, as you're thinking about this particular aspect of assessment, you're looking at the members and how they're functioning. And so if you look in your text, you can find more information about all of these particular items that I've talked about in terms of the self-observation, worker observation, and reports of others outside of the group, as well as the standardized instruments. We also have the task of looking at the group as a whole. Looking at that functioning and really looking at the communication, the interactive process, the cohesion, the social integration, and the culture of the group. These are all things that are very important to pay attention to. For example, as you're looking at how the whole group is functioning, let's say for a moment you were working with a Native American group. Then if you're the lead worker, then you need to be aware of that cultural norm about how Native Americans tend to withhold opinions about other people because of the deep respect for privacy that they have for others and the tradition of non-interference. So going into a group and not having an understanding about how that group functions as a whole from this cultural dynamic can actually lead you down not a very good road, or not a very successful road. So again, making sure that you're paying attention to all these aspects. And you've seen these 4 dynamics before, but again, it's about paying attention to all of those aspects of the work when you're looking at how that group functions as a whole. So how are they communicating? What styles? Are there arguments? Are people trying to dominate the conversation? Do they genuinely like each other and see the importance or the purpose of the task that they're working on? Have they integrated? Is there a clear understanding about what group culture is? All of these are things that you will need to make sure that you pay attention to as you are working in that group setting and doing some assessing of how they're functioning as a whole. Other assessment tools could be things that have been listed in your book, and so you can actually do some charting, and so, or looking at having maybe your co-facilitator spend some time charting the frequency of group interaction. So if you've got a group with 8 folks in it and you're paying attention to how many folks are speaking and who's responding, who's being left out, that gives you a lot of information about things that could be happening in the context of the group that you may need to correct. A sociogram, and you can find a picture of that on page 253, really looks at this whole dynamic of how the communication actually flows, who's talking, who's responding, what kind of temperaments are there in the room, as well as the SYMLOG diagram as well. It's another tool that we use actually to actually look at group progress as it moves forward. So these are some tools that you can utilize as you're thinking about moving forward with looking at your group and what needs to happen there. At the beginning of your groups, you also want to make sure that you're paying attention to the member to leader interaction and making sure that you having or moving towards more member to member interaction. recognizing issues like members attempting to dominate the group discussion and prevent others from interacting. Um, Looking at the norms and recognizing that members will be also trying out roles as they're moving through this particular process. Again, so as we think back and we talk about those particular roles, some of the roles that um, members in the group might play may be actually dysfunctional. So it becomes your role as the leader of the group to actually identify those particular dysfunctional behaviors. And some of the things that the text had indicated that were problematic roles were the scapegoat, the deviant member, the gatekeeper, the internal leader, defensive member, the quiet member, the talkative member, and recognizing that these are all roles that you in your leadership capacity will definitely have to pay attention to in terms of addressing some of those behaviors that you might see as you are working with looking at that particular assessment of group functioning. And so when you find yourself dealing with dysfunctional behaviors, keep in mind that all of these particular behaviors have a meaning. Point out the behavior that you're actually seeing. Ask group members how they experience the other members' behavior. So if you've got a person in the group who's being disruptive, who is stuck, or who is being difficult, these are tactics that you can actually utilize that will help move the work forward. You can identify the feelings and point of views expressed by all the members about that behavior. You can work with all the members to change the role so that they learn to function within the group effectively. So techniques and things that you might want to think about as you move forward in your own group process. This next slide talks about the environment and really recognizing that the environment does play a role. And so when we're thinking about environment, we're really wanting to spend some time and looking at who's sponsoring this group, what's it set up, what is it all about. So typically you're in an agency, they will have clear expectations and purpose for what the actual group is and what it's about and how it's paid for and those kind of things. So it's important to understand that piece, as well as the interorganizational environment. So we're really looking around that environment to make sure that if you're working in a larger agency, are they offering similar types of groups? Do the workers in the organization perceive the needs as similar to what the group in the organization thinks those needs are? Do organizations have policies that may be useful for members in a group? Or could they be linked to other groups? So things like looking at what's happening in that agency are going to be very, very important. As well as when we think about the community environment, it's about the impact that these groups may or may not have on the community. So, for example, historically in Hispanic and African American communities, support groups for people with Alzheimer's may not be very successful because of some of the cultural nuances and the stigma that's really attached to this particular disease as it relates to those particular communities. So really doing an assessment of what's happening and what the needs are in the community by gathering people in focus groups, community assessment needs, or looking at survey data from the state, county, as well as other reports that you can actually utilize that helps you make a decision about moving forward. Finally, it's about then taking this assessment information that you have in terms of how the members function, in terms of how the group functions, in terms of the impact that it has on our organization and the community, and actually looking at blending those assessments or those findings into an evidence-based practice piece. In other words, making sure that the things that you have looked at actually inform what happens in the group process, the group delivery system, to make sure that it's evidence-based and that there's a clear link between the assessment of the groups that you have been running and the intervention or the actual groups that were a result and the outcomes of those particular groups. So keeping these things in mind are going to be very important as you move forward in terms of setting up your own groups and setting up methods by which you will then look at how that assessment plays itself out. So as always, we encourage you to go back to the text and read and do your readings to make sure that you have a better understanding of some of the highlighted items that I've talked about here today with this particular video lecture. And as always, prepare yourself for a review, get ready to do your groups, and I will see you in class. Let's see how it looked. Let's end that meeting.